Gentlemen, good evening. Can I welcome you to the third in our series of Remembering the Future, looking at the decade of anniversaries from 1912 to 1922. Our theme tonight is Nationalism in Ireland, 1900 to 1916, Home Rulers, Separatists and Protestant Nationalists. And we have a lineup of three speakers. Our lead speaker is Professor Michael Laffan, who needs no introduction to many people in the audience, and indeed many former A-level students who have encountered Michael's, either his books or Michael in person giving lectures in places as diverse as Armagh and Enniskillen in the Young Historian Scheme days of the 1990s. Michael has recently retired as a professor in the School of History and Archives at University College Dublin. He's the author of a number of books, a well-known book on the partition of Ireland, published in 1983, and his major book is a study of Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin party, 1916 to 23, which was published in 1999 by Cambridge University Press, The Resurrection of Ireland. And tonight, Professor Laffan will be talking about Carson's example, the radicalisation of Irish nationalism. Professor Michael Laffan.
Thank you very much indeed, Eamon, for that kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be back lecturing in Belfast. It's years since I've done it. I used to be a much more frequent visitor here than sadly has been the case in recent years. So I'm delighted to be here. Long ago, in the 1960s, F.X. Martin edited a book, Leaders and Men of the Easter Rising, Dublin 1916. It included, of course, obvious figures, Tom Clarke, Patrick Pearse and others. It also included Edward Carson and James Craig. And at the time, that seemed odd and perverse to many people. It seemed paradoxical, but then, of course, we historians love paradoxes. But there was a good reason for it. There is a substantial element of justification for including them. Without Carson and Craig, there would have been no Easter Rising, no Anglo-Irish War, no treaty, no Irish Free State. Carson, we know, achieved some of his objectives. He saved the Protestants of Ulster, most of them, from the horrors of Home Rule. He failed, though, to save his own people, Southern Unionists. He left them worse off than before, very few in number, facing an even more deadly enemy, Irish Republicans, than the Home Rulers had been. And along with Craig and various other leaders of the Ulster Volunteers, he triggered events that could not but have appalled him. It wasn't part of his plan, or the plan of any unionist, to radicalize the politics of the whole island. The fact that they did so is one example among so many, many, many examples of the law of unintended consequences, so often encountered in history. In April 1912, a century ago, the future seemed predictable. Home Rule, even if its details were disappointing to Irish nationalists, Home Rule would come into effect within 2 or 3 years. The government had a large majority in the House of Commons. The House of Lords had lost their veto. And there was a confidence on both sides that if Home Rule did come into effect, then its powers would be expanded. There would be a centrifugal tendency in the relations between London and Dublin. Special arrangements would be made for Ulster, which was carefully undefined for a long time, ultimately swept under the carpet in September 1914, the Ulster question revived in 1916 after the Rising, and finally settled in 1920-21, along lines Home Rule, to be exercised by those who had always fought Home Rule, that nobody could have envisaged in 1912. And this was the only aspect, special treatment for Ulster, was the only aspect of the 1912 plans to be implemented. Otherwise, nothing worked as intended or expected. John Redmond and his Home Rule colleagues had, for years, for decades, carefully observed and played by the rules of the game. They had been good Democrats, good parliamentarians, and they had been constantly disappointed and frustrated. Their support in the early years of the 20th century was leaching away. And then, unexpectedly, out of the blue came salvation from the most unlikely of all possible sources, the House of Lords, in ways, along with the Ulster Unionists, the deadliest enemies of Irish nationalism. They triggered a dispute with the Commons, which resulted in their defeat and the end of their veto. They triggered an election years ahead of when it was due in 1910, followed rapidly by another one, both with the same results. Redmond and the Home Rulers holding the balance of power, able to dictate terms to a government, at least up to a point. The result, that government, Asquith's Liberal government, introduced the Third Home Rule Bill, which everybody knew would take 2 years to work its way through Parliament. It could be rejected twice in a row by the House of Lords, but not a third time. So everybody took for granted that sometime in the summer, July, August 1914, the Home Rule question would reach its climax and would be solved. Nobody, of course, could have had any idea that in the history of the world, those months, July and August 1914, would come to have a very different significance. Redmond, it seemed, would now be able to achieve the aims that Parnell and all the Home Rulers had struggled for. Unionist threats of resistance were not taken seriously. They, the Unionists, marched up and down with wooden guns, and the Nationalists mocked them. When Punch and other British journals featured cartoons of Redmond the puppeteer pulling the strings and Asquith, his puppet, jumping as dictated by the Irish boss, those cartoons went down very well indeed in nationalist Ireland. Something must be going right if the British were so alarmed by what Redmond was up to. The popularity of Redmond and his party increased dramatically. The problems of earlier years seemed to be over. Slowly, the measure worked its way through Parliament. But gradually, the Liberal government yielded to the pressure brought to bear on them by the Unionists. They were more worried than Redmond was that there might actually be a rebellion in Ulster. And then, in March and April 1914, suddenly the government's and the Nationalists' position collapsed. First of all, with the so-called Curragh Mutiny. It wasn't a mutiny, but it was an example of the fact that the government could not any longer rely on its army. Followed a month later by the Larne gun running. After that, there was no more mockery about wooden guns. The Ulster Volunteers were now a well-armed force. Partition seemed to be the only solution, a solution which, of course, was deeply unpopular in nationalist Ireland. And then suddenly came the war. Suddenly, just in time to prevent the Home Rule crisis reaching its predestined, its long-expected climax in July or August 1914. The outbreak of war was followed by the enactment and simultaneous postponement of Home Rule. It would come into effect after the war, and after special amending legislation would be passed for Ulster, whatever Ulster was. They were careful, of course, not to define it. Nationalists celebrated, but it turned out to have been a Pyrrhic victory. They had nothing to show for their success. No parliament in Dublin, no jobs for the boys. Irish nationalists began to fear maybe now, yet again, as so often in the past, we will be cheated, we'll be disappointed. The Home Rule Party seemed ever more battered and demoralized, vulnerable to the attacks of its enemies. And prominent among these enemies was the radical Republican revolutionary group, the IRB. The IRB's fortunes had been grim for a very long time. It seemed to be going nowhere. it seemed to be in a hopeless position. A series of reforms enacted by Conservative as well as by Liberal governments ensured that by the early 20th century, the mass of the Irish people, mass of Irish nationalists, were content to operate within the framework of the Act of Union. The Land Acts, above all the Wyndham Act of 1903, brought about a social revolution. Other grievances had been solved. It seemed as if only Home Rule remained to be settled. Ireland was very clearly not in a pre-revolutionary situation. And the position of the IRB was so grave that it was subjected to the ultimate insult. The British government no longer took it seriously, no longer bothered spending, or as the government thought, wasting money infiltrating it, buying informers. It was let carry on drinking, as the government assumed it spent most of its time doing. And of course, the position of the IRB was further weakened when it seemed Home Rule would now at last be granted. But when Carson and the Ulster Volunteers threatened and planned rebellion, when they marched and drilled and imported guns and were not suppressed, on the contrary, were treated with concessions being offered to them, suddenly the methods of the Ulster Volunteers seemed relevant to the circumstances of the time. This seemed a modern way of conducting one's business, a modern way of defying the British government. It seemed as if the patterns of Carson, Craig, and the Ulster Volunteers could be adopted and adapted to Southern Irish circumstances. Rebellion might, after all, be once more on the cards. And after decades of waiting patiently for favorable circumstances, these circumstances had now arrived, courtesy of the Ulster Volunteers. And from the standpoint of many, somebody such as Tom Clark in particular, the circumstances had arrived only just in time. The last rebellion was nearly 50 years ago. The tradition of rebellion seemed as if it was in danger of dying out. Of course, the IRB and others who welcomed the chance of taking arms realized the great irony that they were given their opportunity courtesy of their deadly enemies. The prospect of salvation came from Ulster Unionists. And in effect, the two extremes in Irish public life had developed an informal alliance, a sort of unconscious coalition against the centre, against the moderate, nationalist, democratic, parliamentarian Home Rule Party. One of them had, in effect, the Unionists had given the kiss of life to the other, Irish revolutionaries. Needless to say, such a development appalled the Ulster Unionists. This had not been part of their plan. Irish nationalists of the Home Rule sort were, God knows, bad enough. Irish Republican revolutionaries were infinitely worse. But it is a historical commonplace that people cannot determine the indirect consequences of their actions. And among the indirect consequences of Carson's and Craig's defiance of the British government was the injection of plausibility, of enthusiasm to the Irish revolutionary tradition. And radical nationalists, some of whom belonged to the IRB, but many, such as Owen MacNeill, did not, many Irish nationalists followed Carson's example. Redmond, of course, couldn't. He had to play the responsible politician, the man to whom it would be safe to give power in Dublin in a few years' time. He couldn't, he believed, probably rightly, he couldn't afford the risk of following Carson's example. His position was not desperate, as Carson's was. And also, of course, he, as a Catholic Irish nationalist, had to cope with anti-Irish sentiment in Britain, of the sort that a Protestant Irishman like Carson, a conservative, a unionist, would not have to fear. He wouldn't have the degree of support in Britain that Carson could and did rely on. Redmond felt inhibited, prohibited even, from following Carson's example. So it was other, more extreme nationalists, some of whom had been Home Rulers, people like Owen MacNeill, who were frustrated, fed up, and despairing with what they saw as Redmond's passivity, Redmond's acquiescence, his ability to be outmaneuvered time and time again by Carson. Moderate nationalists like MacNeill joined, and the volunteers led them to an extent, held prominent offices in them, but behind them, pulling the strings in a sort of Freemasonry, were the IRB, who naturally, being a secret society, didn't declare themselves, but naturally, like Freemasons, voted for one another privately to get them onto each other onto committees. They formed a lobby, and some of them rose very high and very quickly in the ranks. Although others, who are later to play an important role in the rising, most prominently P.H. Pearse, were only very late recruits to the IRB. He held a prominent position in the volunteers, but die-hard IRB men, above all Tom Clark, regarded him with suspicion. He had been unacceptably moderate in the past. He had actually welcomed the Home Rule Bill of 1912. He had, it's true, said, if we are cheated again, there will be red war in Ireland. But from his point of view, one of the great attractions, the main attraction of the Third Home Rule Bill was that it would give Irish people a degree of control over their own education, the educational system, and therefore he hoped, help implement a Gaelicization policy in Ireland. So he was prepared to give it a trial. But between 1912 and 14, he, like others, became disillusioned, and also disillusioned by Redmond, and also attracted by the violence, the challenge represented by Carson and the Ulster Volunteers. Many nationalists felt if the government cannot ban, cannot stand up to a group, a paramilitary force, such as the Ulster Volunteers, who are determined to block the government measure of Home Rule, well then, it'll certainly not ban or block another paramilitary force designed to support the government. So we are perfectly safe in organizing a private army, a paramilitary force of our own. So modeled on the Ulster Volunteers, the Irish Volunteers were formed in November 1913. Getting off to a slow start, they soon increased their appeal dramatically, above all with those two events that I've mentioned already, the Curragh incident of March 1914 and the Larne gun running that followed it in April. And in the case of Irish nationalists, there was a third incitement to anger and rage, and that was the Bachelors Walk killings in Dublin at the end of July 1914. The Irish Volunteers, like the Ulster Volunteers, marched and drilled, and ultimately they too were able to import arms, if on a very much smaller scale than that had taken place in Larne a few months earlier. Suddenly, now, in 1913, 14 and 15, talk of and plans for rebellion no longer seemed to be associated with old, forgotten, far-off things and battles long ago. And remember that all those battles had been lost by Irish nationalists. The tradition of rebellion was not an inspiring one. After a long absence or long interval, militarism had returned to Ireland. Redmond was embarrassed and dismayed as he witnessed the spread of the new movement. Initially, he pooh-poohed it, regarded it as irrelevant, then regarded it as a threat, finally decided it was too dangerous to be left intact and tried to take it over himself so that he could neutralize it. And the new movement spread rapidly. It was, by the summer of 1914, almost a counterweight to the Redmondite party. Then came the war. The war, a disaster for Redmond and his Home Rule party. And of course, an opportunity for the IRB. Long afterwards, W.B. Yates wrote under Bear Ben Bulben's head the lines, Mitchell? You that Mitchell's voice have heard, bring war in our time, O Lord. The IRB wanted war. It had hoped at the beginning of the century that the Boer War, in the course of which Britain became intensely unpopular in continental Europe, that the Boer War might embroil Britain in a war with European neighbours, and if that were to happen, then the IRB could stab the British in the back. Nothing happened, at least as far as Europe was concerned, in the Boer War. Now, in 1914, there was a serious war, the gravest war that Britain had ever fought. And the IRB took the very sensible, very rational view, now we can, with some chance of success, stab the British in the back when they have their backs turned to us. Now we can have some hope of getting foreign assistance. In the past, Irish rebels looked to Spain and to France. Now, let us, the IRB, look to Germany. So Casement and others went to Germany, Joseph Plunkett as well, in an attempt to get arms. Redmond, grateful for the implementation, the enactment of Home Rule in September 1914, Redmond supported the war effort. He did so at the very beginning, just after war had been declared. And the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, remarked that Ireland was the one bright spot on the horizon, because it seemed as if the danger of rebellion and civil war in Ireland would now be lessened or eliminated altogether, and Britain would be able to concentrate on a foreign enemy. In fact, the danger of rebellion in Ireland was so great that just a few months later, in March 1915, the Prime Minister, Asquith, wrote an extraordinary memorandum. It was a sort of doodle. In an idle moment or idle half hour, he assessed his own career. And he did so in terms of being judged. Being judged in pagan terms as going to the underworld and being assessed by Rhadamanthus, the judge in the underworld in Hades. And remember that writing about himself, Asquith is using the second person. You did this, you did that. But the you that he's writing about is himself. And in that extraordinary memorandum, Asquith said, you, that is himself, you were extraordinarily lucky in the circumstances of your career, in the special conditions of your time, in the disappearance of possible competitors, and above all, at a crucial moment in your career, in the sudden outbreak of the Great War. Now, that is an extraordinary thing to say, especially for a Prime Minister such as Asquith, who, in contrast to Churchill, hated war. But a world war was a lesser threat than civil war in the United Kingdom. And there were fears of civil war, fully shared by the Prime Minister, fears of a civil war within the United Kingdom. These were now lessened or eliminated, he thought, and at least there would be unity, a common front against the German enemy. The war dragged on, supported by Redmond, who encouraged Irishmen to enlist in the British Army. In his famous Wooden Bridge speech in September 1914, he encouraged a group of volunteers who were marching up and down on parade to join the firing line as far as it extends. And it was that speech, encouraging Irish volunteers to join the British Army, that provoked the split in the Irish volunteers, with significantly the great majority following him and the moderate Home Rule Party, only a small minority following Owen McNeill, the president of the volunteers, and the IRB men who were plotting and scheming behind his back. Even still, in September 1914, Redmond was the voice of Irish nationalism. But his commitment to the war became unpopular as the nature of the war became clear. At the beginning, the war did provoke enthusiasm. It did provoke memories of heroic charges, as in Waterloo. It seemed glamorous. And 2 months after the outbreak of the war, the British comedy journal Punch featured a cartoon, which, not surprisingly, did not feature later on in Mr. Punch's History of the Great War, a collection of cartoons and articles about the war. It features a British soldier in a trench being joined by a newcomer, And the dialogue goes like this. New arrival at the front says, "What's the program?" Old hand, "Well, you lay down in this water and you get peppered all day and night and you have the time of your life." New arrival, "Sounds like a bit of all right. I'm on it." That sort of optimism, that sort of blasé approach to the war soon disappeared as the horrible reality sank in, as it could not but sink in, with the death toll, with reports coming back from letters, not much in letters because they were censored, but much more in terms of sick, wounded soldiers coming home and telling their families and friends what life was actually like. Redmond's support for the war became increasingly unpopular. He always opposed conscription. He never changed his view on that, but he did, to the end, encourage voluntary enlistment. So the war undermined his position and, of course, provided the IRB with at least the prospect, the hopes of a German army arriving. We know now the Germans never thought along those lines. And the prospect of German guns. The Germans did send some guns of probably very limited use, but as we know, they were intercepted and sank when the Ord was scuttled in Cork Harbour. So the war provided the IRB with an opportunity, as simultaneously it undermined the position of Redmond. To that extent, the war completed the process that Redmond and the Ulster Volunteers had begun. And then, in April 1916, came the Easter Rising. Against the odds. It shouldn't have happened. It was the result of a series of flukes in which it seemed as if both sides were competing with the other as to who could make the most mistakes. And ultimately, the British made the last and fatal mistake by assuming that since they knew a rising was going to take place, and the rebels knew they knew, and since the arms had been intercepted and were now at the bottom of the sea, and since the leader who was to arrive to lead the rising was now a prisoner in their hands, of course they didn't know that Roger Casement had arrived in Ireland in an attempt to stop the rising, not to lead it. Under these circumstances, they felt, the rising can't happen. It can't take place. Aren't we lucky? What a close shave. It could have taken place yesterday, the day before. Now we have time on our hands. We can relax. We can draw up lists of what we need to do, whom we need to arrest. But we leave it until Tuesday, until after the end of the bank holiday. And of course, on Monday, the rebels struck. And it was as he was sitting in his office in Dublin Castle, drawing up lists of those who were to be arrested the next day, that Matthew Nathan, the Undersecretary, heard shooting outside and realized it's too late. They've gone and done it. So, the rising completed the pattern of destroying moderate nationalism. A rising of the sort that Redmond had always tried hard to avoid. And this Easter Rising that transformed Irish history can be seen as a paradoxical implementation of the plans that had been made by Carson, Craig, and other Unionists before the war. An implementation by the Unionists' deadly enemies, by Republican revolutionaries who had a very different agenda, but who, nonetheless, followed Carson's example.